October 15th, 1890, New Orleans. It's late after 11 p.m. The kind of late where the city begins to empty out, where the noise fades and what's left behind feels exposed. Rain falls steadily, tapping against rooftops, pooling in the streets, softening the glow of gas lamps into a hazy blur. Shadows stretch longer, footsteps carry farther. The air is thick, damp, and heavy. And walking through it is David C. Hennessy, superintendent of police, one of the best-known men in the community. He is in his early 30s, but already carries the weight of a man who has lived hard and fast. Tall, composed, confident, a presence people recognize immediately and not always comfortably. He is admired by some, feared by others, and resented by more than a few. Years earlier, he had been tied to the killing of Thomas Devereaux, a rival for chief of detectives. Whether that was justice or something else depends on who you ask. But on this night, it isn't his past that hangs over him. It's the work he's been doing in the present. Because by 1890, the conflict within New Orleans' Sicilian community is no longer hidden. It is playing out in the open. Two factions, the Provenzano family and the Matranga family, are locked in a sustained struggle for control of the waterfront and the fruit trade. It is a fight rooted in business, but shaped by influence, loyalty, and force. Hennessy has placed himself squarely in the middle of it. He has already put members of the Provenzano faction behind bars, and their appeal trial is approaching. At the same time, he has been investigating the Matranga side, particularly Joseph P. Macheca, a powerful figure in the city's shipping and produce trade, a man with influence that extends well beyond the docks. And the situation is anything but straightforward. There are reports, uncertain but persistent, that Hennessy had been prepared to introduce new evidence at the upcoming trial, evidence that might clear the Provenzanos and implicate the Matrangas. If that is true, then Hennessy is no longer just investigating a conflict, he is shaping its outcome. And whether he takes it seriously or not, he has become a part of it. In the days leading up to this night, the warnings have come, death threats, direct, unambiguous. He is being watched. He is told to stop. He does not. When asked about the threats, he is said to have brushed them aside.
The mafia doesn't scare me.
The city's mayor is less certain. Concerned for his safety, the mayor arranges for Hennessy to have protection, a private escort from the Boylan Detective Agency, a man named Captain William Billy O'Connor. On this night, O'Connor is with him. The two men leave police headquarters together, stepping out into the rain-soaked streets, their conversation carried in low tones beneath the steady fall of water. At one point, O'Connor suggests they take Basin Street. Hennessy's home sits on Girard, between Basin and Franklin, an easy route. But Hennessy shakes his head. Quote, "No, let's walk up Rampart Street, our usual route. The sidewalks on Basin Street are very bad." Close quote. So they turn instead toward Rampart. Along the way, at Hennessy's urging, they stop at Dominic Vergette's Oyster Saloon at the corner of Rampart and Poydras. Inside, the moment is almost disarmingly ordinary. Each man eats half a dozen oysters. Hennessy drinks a glass of milk. A brief pause, nothing more. Then they step back out into the night. They continue up the wood side of Rampart Street, heading towards Girard. Not far now, just a short walk to Hennessy's home. Until, about 2 blocks from his door, they slow, pause, and Hennessy turns to O'Connor. Quote, "Don't come any further with me now. You go on and look after your business." Close quote. It's a strange instruction, unexpected, but O'Connor does not argue. They exchange a few final words, say goodnight, and then, for reasons that remain unclear even now, O'Connor turns and walks away, leaving Hennessy alone, unguarded. The man assigned to protect him soon disappears into the rainy night, and Hennessy continues on alone towards Basin Street. He turns onto Girard Street. His home is right there, 50 feet, perhaps less. Then, a whistle. Sharp, deliberate. Hennessy turns toward the sound, a 2-story frame house at the uptown river corner of Girard and Basin Streets, and then the night erupts. Gunfire tears through the darkness, shotguns, several fired at close range. The blasts are deafening, the spread immediate and devastating. 5 men concealed in the shadows, firing almost as one, Luparas. Hennessy is struck by 6 shots, but he doesn't fall without resistance. Even as the force of the blasts hit him, he draws his Colt and fires back into the darkness, returning fire toward the flashes, toward the shapes he can barely see. The attackers scatter, their forms dissolving into the night as quickly as they appeared. And then, silence, broken only by the rain. Moments later, movement. O'Connor. He hears the shots, sees the flashes, turns and runs back toward them, toward the sound, toward the man he just left behind. He finds Hennessy at his doorstep, collapsed, bleeding heavily, barely conscious. O'Connor drops beside him, trying to lift him, trying to make sense of what has just happened, and Hennessy, still holding on, still conscious enough to speak, looks up at him and forces the words out. Oh, Billy, they have given it to me." He struggles for breath.
"And I gave it back the best I could."
O'Connor leans closer.
Who gave it to you, Dave?
Hennessy's voice is barely there now, a whisper.
Douglas.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Gangland History Podcast. I'm your historian, Jacob Stoops. This episode is part 4 of our ongoing series on the history of the Pittsburgh Mafia. Up to this point, we've been watching something take shape, slowly at first, and then all at once. In the earliest days, it begins in the shadows. Black hand extortion, small, localized violence, old world customs carried into new neighborhoods where the law doesn't always reach. Over time, those scattered acts begin to evolve into something more structured, less visible, but more deliberate. Under figures like Salvatore Catanzaro and Gregorio Conti, those loose networks begin to consolidate, not into something fully formalized, not into something easily defined, but into something more controlled. Power starts to concentrate, even if it never fully settles. And then Conti is killed, and everything breaks apart. 4 years later, it happens again. When we last left off, Martin M. Burke, the man widely regarded as Pittsburgh's king of the bootleggers, had just been murdered. Burke had done something few others could. He bridged the gap between the old world of saloons and political influence and the new underground economy of Prohibition. He organized it, scaled it, turned it into something resembling an industry. And with his death, that structure collapses. Now the vacuum returns, only this time the stakes are higher. Because by the mid-1920s, Prohibition is no longer new, it is entrenched. The infrastructure is in place, the money is enormous. Bootlegging is no longer scattered and experimental, it is a fully realized underground economy. And suddenly there is no clear leader in Pittsburgh. In the immediate aftermath, there are men who appear positioned to take control, figures like Giuseppe Peppino Cusimano, Nicola Nick Gentile, and Salvatore Calderone, men tied to the earlier generation with experience, connections, and some credibility. But none of them consolidates power. None of them impose order, because Prohibition doesn't reward stability, it rewards ambition, and it favors a different kind of operator. By the mid-1920s, a new generation begins forcing its way into the center of the story, the Monastero brothers. Stefano, who will come to be known as Big Steve, his brother and partner in crime, Salvatore or Sam, and their older brother, Loreto. All three come of age in the shadow of the same family history, but they do not choose the same path. Stefano and Sam step directly into the world of organized crime, building power quickly and deliberately. Loreto, by contrast, remains outside of it, not untouched, but never fully inside. His role in the story is smaller, but it matters, and you'll see why. For this episode, Stefano Monastero becomes our central figure. At first glance, the Monasteros can seem like they come out of nowhere. They don't. Their family is already tied to one of the most infamous episodes in early mafia history. But what makes them different is not where they come from, it's what they build. Because unlike the men who came before them, the Monasteros are not inheriting a system, they are constructing one, and they are doing it at exactly the right time. This is the point where Pittsburgh's underworld stops pretending at unity and begins openly fighting for dominance. Bootleg gang against bootleg gang, territory against territory. Violence escalating as the profits grow and the stakes climb higher with each passing year. And at the center of that shift is Stefano Monastero, a man who, more than most, is built for this moment. This is where the story changes, because what begins in this episode is not just another phase of organized crime in Pittsburgh, it's the beginning of something more recognizable, more structured, more ruthless, and far more dangerous. Because the Prohibition years in Pittsburgh will prove to be every bit as bloody, if not more so, than what was unfolding in cities like Chicago and New York. A reality we'll be exploring over the next several episodes. Before we go any further, a quick word for any new listeners. On this podcast, we don't romanticize, we don't sensationalize. What we do is dig through archives, police reports, court records, FBI files, books, and long-forgotten newspaper columns to reconstruct what actually happened as responsibly and accurately sourced as possible. This is Pittsburgh in the early Prohibition years, a city full of money, guns, and unfinished business. Now, let's get into it. The 1919 murder of Gregorio Conti didn't just remove a leader, it removed the only thing holding Pittsburgh's underworld together. But even that raises a deeper question. What exactly was Conti? Because what he built doesn't clearly resemble a formal mafia organization, not in the structured sense we came to recognize later with defined hierarchy, rules, and succession. There's no clear evidence of that kind of system in place during his time. Instead, Conti's power appears to have been intensely personal, constructed through relationships, alliances, and his own capacity for force, and for a time, it worked. He was able to bring together competing factions, Sicilian mafia groups, and the remnants of the Camorra under a single functioning system. But whether that system was truly mafia in the traditional sense is far less certain. Much of what we think we know comes from the later accounts, particularly from Nicola Gentile, who described these events through his own lens. But outside of that, the record is thin. What is clear is that whatever Conti had built depended entirely on him, and when he died, that system died with him. There was no successor waiting in the wings, no structure capable of absorbing the loss. What followed wasn't a transition of power, but a return to fragmentation. By the early 1920s, Pittsburgh was no longer controlled by a single organization. It was divided into competing gangs, each one tightly organized, territorial, and protective of its own rackets. Neighborhoods became boundaries, supply lines became lifelines, and every group operated with one eye on its rivals. The city wasn't ruled, it was contested. And then Prohibition hit, not gradually, but all at once, and with it came more money than anyone had ever conceived or seen in their lives. Bootlegging didn't just expand the underworld, it reshaped it entirely. It flipped it on its head. Small-time operators became major players almost overnight, and loosely organized crews hardened into structured factions built around production, distribution, and enforcement. Control of alcohol meant control of everything, and in that kind of environment, violence wasn't incidental, it was essential. It became the system through which power was asserted, defended, and taken. You could see it in the rise of bootleggers like Martin Burke, and you could see it again in his murder in 1923. But just as telling was what didn't follow. Even after Burke's death, no single figure emerged to unify the city. No one had the reach, the structure, or the authority to impose order, not right away. Pittsburgh remained divided, a patchwork of competing interests where power wasn't inherited or assigned, it was seized. And by the mid-1920s, two men began to seize it, Stefano and Salvatore Monastero, or as their friends call them, Steve and Sam. They had not come out of nowhere. From the earliest days of Prohibition, they had been building quietly, deliberately, learning the routes, securing suppliers, establishing distribution networks, and surrounding themselves with loyal, capable muscle. While others fought over territory, the Monasteros were figuring out how to control it all. By the time the dust began to settle, they were no longer just gang leaders, they were the dominant force on Pittsburgh's north side, and Stefano in particular was the closest thing the city had to a man capable of putting it all back together. By 1925, Stefano Monastero sat at the pinnacle, the most powerful figure in Pittsburgh's mafia underworld, the closest thing the city would ever have to its own Al Capone. But to understand how he got there, you have to go back. You have to. Because Monastero didn't just step into power, he was built for it. The history of the mafia was in his blood. Stefano Giuseppe Monastero was born on March 4th or March 5th, 1889 in Caccamo, Sicily, to Pietro Monastero and Giuseppe Gianfortoni. The youngest of 7 children, he grew up in a family shaped by the realities of the time. 2 of his siblings died in early childhood, leaving 4 others who survived alongside him. His brothers Loreto and Salvatore, later known as Sam, and his sisters Maria Rosa and Providenza. According to records, Stefano's father, Pietro, would immigrate to the United States, arriving in New York Harbor in 1890, declaring his intention to travel not to Pittsburgh, but to New Orleans in 1890. In the manifest, he would list his calling as calzolio, which in English translates to shoemaker or shoe repair, essentially a cobbler. In Caccamo, he had been a shoemaker as well, or at least listed his occupation as such when he and Giuseppe married in 1877. Caccamo rises high above Sicily's northern coast, a fortress town of stone and shadow perched roughly 1,700 feet above sea level, its massive Norman castle dominating both the skyline and the lives of those beneath it. It sits inland from the port city of Termini Imerese and about 20 miles southeast of Palermo, close enough to feel the pull of the island's capital, but far enough removed to exist in its own world. Even today, Caccamo is home to only around 8,000 people, and in the late 1800s, when Pietro Monastero is growing up here, that number would have been smaller still. A tight, insular community where everyone knows everyone and where power is local, visible, and personal. In the mid to late 1800s, this is Western Sicily in its purest form, rural, isolated, and governed less by the state than by the realities on the ground. Narrow streets wind between tightly packed homes, churches anchor daily life, and beyond the town, the countryside stretches into estates worked by laborers who rarely own the land they toil. This is not a place where authority feels distant. It is distant. In 19th century Sicily, the reach of the Italian state is weak, uneven, and often distrusted. The island is still absorbing the upheaval of unification after Garibaldi's campaign in 1860, and for many communities like Caccamo, little has changed in practical terms. Protection, justice, and order are not guaranteed, they are negotiated. And it is exactly this environment that something else takes root. What we now call the Sicilian Mafia does not emerge as a formal organization overnight, but as a system, one built around private protection, influence, and force. Landowners need security, merchants need goods moved safely, crops need to be guarded, and where the state cannot provide it, others step in. Over time, these networks harden into something more structured, more secretive, and more powerful, more ruthless. Scholars consistently place that development right here in western Sicily in the second half of the 19th century. Caccamo sits inside that world. That doesn't mean Pietro Monastero is a mafioso. There is no direct evidence to say that, but it does mean something important. He is living in a place where mafia influence is not abstract or distant, but part of the social fabric. The codes of loyalty, silence, patronage, and local power aren't theoretical. They are learned, observed, and understood from a young age. So the question lingers, was Pietro part of that system, or simply a man trying to navigate it? At this distance, we can't say for certain, but either way, he would have known how that worked. In towns like Caccamo, you didn't have to be inside it to feel its presence. It was simply there, and like so many Sicilian men of his generation, Pietro likely looks beyond it, toward America. By the late 19th century, a pattern has already taken hold. Men leave first, they find work, establish a foothold, and send money back home. Then, when the time is right, they bring their families over. It's a system built on risk, but also on hope. In Pietro's case, he went to America in order to make some money to pay back a debt he'd incurred in Sicily. For many Sicilians, that journey leads to one place in particular, New Orleans, the place we visited in the opening of this episode. The connection isn't accidental. Trade routes between Palermo and New Orleans, especially in citrus, have already created steady lines of movement across the Atlantic. Those lines become migration pathways reinforced by family ties, village connections, and word passed quietly from one man to another. So even if we can't say exactly why Pietro chooses New Orleans, it's unlikely he's going in blind. Someone has been there before him. Someone is waiting for him there, likely family or friends, waiting with the promise of a job, opportunity, freedom. But New Orleans in the late 1800s is not just a place of opportunity, it's a city of transition. A port city layered with cultures, languages, and competing interests where old world identities don't disappear, they collide. Sicilian immigrants are arriving in growing numbers, carving out space in neighborhoods, businesses, and labor networks, while at the same time drawing deep suspicion from those already there. Tensions simmer beneath the surface, ethnic, economic, and social, rarely constant, but never fully gone. And alongside all of that, there are whispers. Whispers of secret societies, of organized groups operating beneath the surface, of something carried over from Sicily and taking root on American soil. In hindsight, we know those fears weren't imagined. The mafia was very real, already taking shape in Sicily and in time establishing itself in places like New Orleans and New York. But in the late 19th century, it wasn't widely understood, not clearly defined, and certainly not romanticized the way it would be decades later. But what people did understand was violence, and that mattered. Because in a city already strained by economic competition and cultural division, suspicion doesn't require proof, it only needs a target. Sicilian immigrants arriving in growing numbers often became that target. Old world identities don't fade in New Orleans, they harden, lines are drawn, and in an era where bigotry and racism are not hidden but openly expressed, those tensions are not subtle. They are visible and they are very dangerous. Pietro Monastero steps into that world without the benefit of hindsight. To him, it is a chance, a foothold, a future, but the city he has entered is already on the edge. Because this tension has been building for years, along the docks, in the markets, in the streets where business identity and power intersect. Rivalries have taken shape, alliances have shifted, grievances have deepened. What began as competition has become something far more entrenched and far more personal. And now it's about to break. And when it does, it will pull Pietro Monastero and his family directly into it, in ways he could never have anticipated, in ways that will shape the course of his son's life. And so now, we return to where this story began. October 15th, 1890. Police Chief David C. Hennessy lies bleeding just 50 feet from his front door. He is still alive, barely. Despite grievous wounds to his upper body, he is lifted onto a horse-drawn wagon and rushed through the streets to Charity Hospital, the wheels rattling over wet pavement as word of the shooting spreads almost instantly across the city. By the time he arrives, the hospital is already filling. Friends, officers, onlookers, men who know exactly what this means. Inside, Assistant House Surgeon Dr. Bloom conducts an examination. The damage is severe. Hennessy has been struck multiple times, 4 major wounds tearing into the left side of his body across both the upper and lower chest. The injuries are deep, ragged, devastating. Additional wounds mark his arms and legs, a bullet lodged beneath the knee, another tearing through the elbow joint, others grazing flesh. It is not a question of treatment, it is a question of time. There is nothing to be done but bandage the wounds and send for a priest. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, last rites are administered, and still, somehow, Hennessy lingers, conscious, fading, but aware. In those final hours, he is able to speak, not much, not always clearly, but enough to leave behind something that will echo far beyond this room. He does not name specific men, but he makes one thing clear.
David, who did this? Who did this?
The Italians. The Italians shot me.
"10 hours after the shooting, just after 9 o'clock the following morning, October 16th, 1890, David C. Hennessy dies.
I'm sad to inform you all that our city's beloved police chief has passed away this morning.
His death sends a shock through the city. Messages of condolences are received from all over the United States, but it is what follows in the time ahead that will make this moment truly infamous. Because this is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of something far larger and far worse, something that will grip New Orleans and reach far beyond it. This is a story too large to tell in full here. We'll return to it in a future episode, but it's a story that intersects with our subject in a very personal way, and so parts of it must be told. Which brings us to the natural question. What does this have to do with Stefano Monastero's father, Pietro? I've got an answer. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, New Orleans Mayor Joseph A. Shakespeare, yes, Shakespeare, issues sweeping orders.
Scour the whole neighborhood. Arrest every Italian you come across if necessary, and scour it again tomorrow morning as soon as there is daylight enough. Get all the men you need.
It is a response driven as much by fear as it is by urgency, and it sets something in motion, because Pietro Monastero, 42 years old at the time, happens to be living in the worst possible place imaginable, right across from Hennessy's home at the corner of Girard and Basin Streets. Within hours of the shooting, around midnight, Pietro is arrested, not as a witness, not for questioning, but as an accessory to the murder, both before and after the fact. The reason? He's identified as the occupant of a room adjoining the alley where the assassins are believed to have hidden, and that is enough. From that point forward, Pietro Monastero remains present in the record, but not always clearly, his identity obscured by repeated misspellings and inconsistencies. Newspapers struggle, or perhaps don't try very hard, to get his name right. He appears as Peter Monastero, Peter Mostero, Peter Mosterio, Peter Monastero, Pietro Monastero, anything and everything except who he actually is. But we know from the details reported at the time, from the location, from the age, from the circumstances, and we know from his family, who were kind enough to speak with me ahead of this episode, that this man is Stefano Monastero's father. The Times-Picayune would report the arrest this way. About midnight, Sergeant McCabe and officers Emmanuel arrested Peter Mosterio, age 42 years, an Italian shoemaker at the corner of Girard and Basin Streets, and locked him up as an accessory before and after the fact. Mostero hails from the French market and has only been in this country 2 months. He does not speak English, and there was nobody around to take his explanation in Italian. Hennessy's immense popularity places enormous pressure on the city to find those responsible, and so Pietro is swept up, but he is far from alone. In the hours following the shooting, dozens of Italians are rounded up, swept into custody, not necessarily because of what they have done, but because of who they are, Italians. Or as Hennessy put it, Dagos, a word used at the time not simply as a description, but as an accusation, a derogatory one at that. Eventually, 19 men are indicted for the murder and held without bail in the Parish prison. 3 days later, on October 18, 1890, David C. Hennessy is laid to rest. Crowds gather first at his home on Girard Street, where his body lies in state, before following the procession to Metry Cemetery. It is one of the largest funerals in the city's history. The city mourns, but it does not calm. Months pass, and in March of 1891, many of the accused are finally brought to trial. From the beginning, the proceedings are troubled, marked by allegations of jury tampering and questions about the integrity of the case itself. For example, on the night that Monastero was arrested and charged for the murder, he was searched and only a receipt for $3, several religious pictures, and a pocketbook were found on his person. Certainly not the arsenal of an assassin or even someone who was well-to-do. And then, a verdict is returned. March 13th, 1891. In a stunning turn, none of the defendants are convicted. Some are acquitted. In Pietro's case, the jury fails to reach a decision, a mistrial. He's described as trembling, colorless, as the verdict is read aloud. Not relief, something closer to dread.
I understand that as to Polix, Scafati, and Monastero, you are unable to agree?
Yes.
Inside the courtroom, reactions are immediate: shock, anger, disbelief. Outside, word spreads rapidly. And as it spreads, something begins to build. A mass meeting is called. Citizens gather not to deliberate, but to act.
We got things. The courts have failed us today. We must take the justice they refuse to give to the streets.
The defendants are not released. They are actually sent back to Parish prison. And by the next day, a crowd begins to form. At first, it's small. Then it grows and grows until nearly 20,000 people stand outside the prison walls, fueled by outrage, by rumor, by something deeper. The belief that justice has failed and that it must now be carried out by other means and taken directly into their hands. They batter down the gates. They storm the prison. What follows is one of the darkest moments in American history. In the chaos, prisoners are dragged from their cells. 2 men are hauled outside and lynched from lampposts and trees. Inside, others are shot, clubbed, killed where they stand. 11 men in total, among them Pietro Monastero, the cobbler from Caccamo, the father of the boys who will one day become our story. He's not among the first to die. Instead, he's among the men who retreat deeper into the prison, hiding inside a cell with several other inmates, away from the main corridors, away from the initial surge of violence. As the mob moves inwards, inside the prison, panic spreads. Some attempt to run. They are cut down immediately. Pietro does not run. He crouches behind the body of another man pressed against the cell door, waiting and hiding. And then a shot. It strikes him in the back of the head. He collapses, but he's not dead. As he raises a blood-stained hand to his neck, someone notices the movement.
Still alive. Give him another load.
I've a gun. Will this do?
Yes, anything'll do for the Dago. Shoot him again!
I ain't got the heart to kill him. Here, you do it.
Dust is settling heavy on the mirrors, sweet and sick. The air
He is believed to be the last of the victims to die that day. A husband, a father of 5 children still in Sicily, gone. And in the aftermath, the press does not question what has happened, it actually celebrates it. A headline the next morning from the New Delta reads, "Lynched, Chief D.C. Hennessy's murder avenged and outraged. Justice condemns a bribed jury. 11 Italians pay the penalty of their crimes." Another from the Times-Democrat reads, "Avenged, D.C. Hennessy's murderers killed by the enraged populace. A mass meeting converted into a party of vigilantes." Guilt is assumed, due process is forgotten, and in the eyes of many, justice has been done. In the days and weeks that followed the lynchings, there was, remarkably, no real criminal accountability. A grand jury was convened in New Orleans to investigate the mob violence. It returned no indictments. The killings carried out in broad daylight by thousands of citizens went effectively unpunished. But while the city moved on, the world did not. News of the lynchings reached Italy, and the reaction was immediate and furious. The Italian government condemned the killings as an attack not just on individuals, but on Italian nationals under the protection of the United States. Among the victims was Pietro Monastero, an Italian citizen, a man who had not been convicted of any crime. Italy demanded justice. When none came, diplomatic relations between the United States and Italy deteriorated rapidly. The Italian government withdrew its ambassador from Washington, and in response, the United States recalled its own ambassador from Rome. For a time, the two nations stood on the brink of a full diplomatic break. The crisis was only resolved when the United States agreed to pay reparations, $25,000, to the families of the victims, including those like Pietro, who had never been found guilty of anything. No one was punished, but money was paid, and the message was clear. When the victims were Italian, justice could be negotiated. And within a year of the lynchings, in 1892, President Benjamin Harrison declared a national observance marking the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. It was, in part, an effort to ease tensions with Italy and to recognize Italian Americans at a moment when they had been violently targeted and widely vilified. It's worth noting that the anniversary of Columbus's landing had been observed in the United States before, and plans for a 400th anniversary celebration were already underway prior to the lynchings. But the timing of this gesture, coincidental or not, was significant. A symbolic recognition following one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. This is why we have Columbus Day today.
He discovered America is what he did. He was a brave Italian explorer, and in this house, Christopher Columbus is a hero. End of story.
2 months after Pietro's murder, in May of 1891, the Times-Democrat published a heartbreaking account of how his family in Caccamo was faring in the aftermath of his death. The report originated with the New York Herald, which had sent a correspondent across the Atlantic to visit the families of the victims. What he found was transmitted by cable from Palermo and then reprinted in New Orleans for the public to read. What becomes clear is this: while Pietro's family knew that he was dead, they did not fully understand the circumstances of how he died, and rather than shield them from that reality, their grief was made public. I'm sharing this account because it is, in many ways, one of the most poignant pieces of reporting connected to this entire story. Washington, May 5th, the New York Herald printed this morning the following cable from Palermo.
I wish the man who led the lynches at New Orleans had been with me yesterday when I rode over the mountains to Caccamo in search of the widow and orphans of Pietro Monastero. High up on a crag among the crooked streets of a village that existed before Christ, I found her. Below, the valleys were full of orange groves and flowers. Above, the ancient castle of Caccamo and the giant sun-scorched rocks, among which the bandits held the merchant Arrigo for ransom last year, in spite of a battalion of troops sent to find him. Down the craggy lane I crept to the dim room from which Monastero went less than 2 years ago to America. Bronzed mountaineers and their children clattered out to see the Herald correspondent, who had come all the way from St. Petersburg to visit the families of the slain Sicilians. I have looked upon sorrow in many lands, but here I saw the most pitiful scene of my life. In the middle of a bare stone chamber sat the widow, draped from head to foot in black in the native manner. Around her stood the 5 small orphans of the dead man, 3 toddling boys and 2 girls. The widow's face was Madonna-like in its simple beauty. Her eyes were soft and dark. On a rude table beside her were a few handfuls of raw wheat, contributed by the neighbors to feed the little ones. On the wall was the dusty crucifix at which Monastero prayed for success on the day he left his mountain home. Around the room sat the 5 sisters of the dead man, and the doorway was choked up with the neighbors, who told me how good Monastero had been to the poor, and how everybody was contributing a few centimes to keep his helpless family from starvation. I heard for the first time that Monastero was a member of the municipal council and a hard-working, respectable shoemaker who went to New Orleans to get money enough to pay his village debts. One mountaineer showed me a list of names scrawled down by the committee that collected enough every day to barely feed the orphans. When I told the widow why her husband was killed by the New Orleans mob, she cried like a child. "God in heaven, how could they murder the father of these helpless children?" she wailed. "My poor husband, he was killed by cowards where he could not help himself. A better, truer man never lived. No, I want no vengeance, no vendetta. I want no blood. What do I care whether his murderers are punished or not? It will not bring my poor husband back to life. Oh God, 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 if you had only seen him here and known what a good man he was." The frail figure in black trembled, and everyone in the room began to cry. In the name of God, see how his children refuse to wear black, because they do not believe their father is dead. 2 of them do not remember him at all, and I have no photograph to show them. Ask everyone in the mountains about my husband. He never did wrong in his life, and he wrote to me from prison saying that he was innocent and asking me to pray to Holy Saint Joseph to send him back to his home. We prayed night and day to our good patron saint. He was not guilty. Never, never, never. It is impossible. I cannot understand how he came to be with those other men, but I know he committed no crime. It was all a cruel mistake. Why did they not send him away from America instead of killing him? My husband was a shoemaker and got into debt. Because he was an honest man, he went to America to earn money enough to pay his debts. Then he was coming back to Caccamo and was never, never going away again. If I could only get his body so I might take the children to his grave. No, I do not think the American people are cruel. They must be sorry for the murder of my husband, and for me and my children. We have nothing to eat now but what the people give us. My husband's 5 sisters and his own father and mother are all supported by his brother, a priest, who only gets 1 lira and a half a day, 30 cents. And are you sorry for us too? I have to leave the house. The scene became too terrible. Higher up among the crumbling walls, I found the white-haired father and mother of Monastero, sitting in a dreary hutch. The poor priest Giuseppe came down from the sleeping loft. "Ah," he says, "I am glad the herald has sent for the truth. My brother was a spotless man, and I firmly believe he was innocent. The priest spoke pure Italian, but now and then he would drop of a word of two in the Sicilian dialect to comfort his old parents. Pietro used to write me from prison, telling me he was innocent. He even wrote poetry to me. A guilty man could not write such letters. He went to America because he could not bear to be in debt. He had a credit of 450 lire for his little shoe shop, and when he failed in business, it was simply because the times were hard. When I asked the priest if the people of Caccamo had any desire for vengeance, he made the sign of the cross and shook his head sadly. No, we only weep and pray for the soul of my brother and try to feed his widow and orphans. Life is very hard here. They call my brother mafioso, but they speak words they don't understand. The mafia passed away from this land long ago. There is no such thing now. Tell the American people that we are honest folks who cannot understand how they allowed an innocent man to be publicly murdered. Tell them his widow and orphans are helpless. Everyone in the village had a sad story to tell, and the venerable bandmaster said that everybody understood that the American Republic was not a nation of savages, but that the lynching was done under extraordinary circumstances. He said that only yesterday 8 men left Caccamo to seek their fortunes in New Orleans. Everyone in the village had a printed copy of an eulogy of the dead Monastero, written by Reverend M. Quigenti. But not alone at Caccamo did I find mourning. There is a confused jumble of poor dwellings along the seafront of Palermo, and hundreds of Sicilians have gone out from these winding streets to start for America.
Of course, what stands out in this account is not the absence of the mafia, but the way it is addressed, acknowledged, and then the existence firmly denied.
They call my brother mafioso, but they speak words they don't understand. The mafia passed away from this land long ago. There is no such thing now.
But that denial has to be understood in context. In Sicily at the time, speaking openly about the mafia, especially in any way that might implicate family, was not without risk. In fact, it was a death sentence, so the priest and the family have to be careful with what they say, or else they too could pay the consequences. We too have to be careful. Careful not to take that denial at face value, but also careful not to assume guilt simply because the accusation existed. Because when you step back and look at the totality of the evidence, there is very little to suggest that Pietro Monastero was a mafioso. That possibility can't be entirely ruled out, but it is far from proven. What does seem far more likely is something simpler and far more tragic, that Pietro was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A man living across the street from a targeted police chief, a man occupying a space that was used, with his knowledge or not, by the real perpetrators. And when the system came looking for answers, he was close enough to take the blame. Arrested, swept into a prison filled with men just like him, many unproven, many likely innocent. And when the mob came, he was still there, trapped inside Parish prison with nowhere to run and no one coming to stop it. Close enough not just to be accused, but to die for it. The middle brother, Salvatore Sam Monastero, just a few years older than Stefano, would speak publicly about the trauma their family endured nearly 4 decades later. In a reluctant interview, Sam reflected. In telling of how he started life, Monastero said he did not remember the killing except as told to him by members of his family. Steve, his brother, did not remember his father at all, he said. Samuel then was only 3 and Steve was but a few months old when their father was killed, Samuel related. They had been in this country only a short while, having been born in Italy. The father had come to this country some years before and later returned to bring them back with him. The scars of that day never fully faded, but there's something worth noting here. In Sam's later recollection, the family is described as being in New Orleans at the time of the murder, yet contemporary reporting written in the immediate aftermath places them back in Sicily. So which is it? It's difficult to say with certainty. Memories shift, stories evolve, especially when they're carried across decades. But based on the weight of the evidence, it appears more likely that the family was still in Caccamo when Pietro was killed. That said, it can't be ruled out entirely that they were in the United States at the time of the Parish prison lynchings. What we can say with confidence is this: Pietro never returns home. His body is buried in New Orleans at Holt Cemetery. In the aftermath, the rest of the Monastero family is in Caccamo, quietly, out of view. It is there that the boys grow up without ever knowing their father, without his guidance, without his protection, and eventually their path leads them back across the ocean to the same country that had taken him from them. And it's there that I'm reminded of another line from another figure in organized crime history, Raymond Patriarca of Providence, who also lost his father at a young age. In 1959, during questioning by none other than Bobby Kennedy, Patriarca was asked why he had gotten involved in crime. His answer isn't complicated, it isn't defiant, it's something else entirely. It's benign, if not downright sad. It comes in the form of a question. Why does a lot of young fellas do a lot of things? 'Cause they ain't got a father. It's a simple statement, but it carries weight, because while Sam and Stefano would ultimately be responsible for the lives they chose, that absence doesn't just disappear. It follows them across years, across oceans, back to the same country that had already changed the course of their lives forever. Back to the United States. Destination, Pittsburgh. But before we go any further in our story, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. Returning to earlier in the episode, let's briefly cover some ground we've already touched on, because to understand what's coming, we must return once more to where it begins. In March of 1889, in the fortress town of Caccamo, Sicily, Stefano Giuseppe, he would go by Joseph Monastero, is born into a world already defined by struggle. The youngest child of Pietro and Giuseppe Monastero, he grows up in a family where loss is not uncommon. 2 siblings die in early childhood, and not long after, the family suffers another blow with the catastrophic loss of his father, while Stefano is so young that he has no memory of the man. What remains is a household shaped by absence as much as presence. The ones who grow up together, Loreto, Salvatore, Maria Rosa, and Providenza, form the world Stefano knows. His brother Loreto, the oldest, is born in 1880, the second child in the family to carry that name after the first Loreto dies in infancy. Salvatore, who will later be known as simply Sam, is born in 1886, also named for a brother the family has already lost. And then there is Stefano, 9 years younger than Loreto, 3 years younger than Sam, the youngest, but not for long the one farthest down the line in the proverbial pecking order. All of them born in Caccamo, a fortress town in Sicily that was by this time very much a mafia town, a place where power is understood early, where loyalty is enforced, and where the lines between family survival and violence are often indistinguishable. And as we move through this story, you're going to notice something about these brothers. There's a dynamic here that feels familiar. If you've seen The Godfather, the 1972 film, you'll already understand the framework, because in a lot of ways, the Monastero brothers mirror the Corleone family. Stefano aligns most closely with Michael Corleone. Quiet, observant, unassuming at first glance, by all accounts from his own family, quiet, gentle, well-liked. Not the kind of man who immediately draws attention in a room. And yet there's a quiet force to him, the kind of presence that doesn't demand respect, but somehow leaves people with very little choice but to give it, because underneath that calm exterior is something far more controlled and far more dangerous. He doesn't chase power, he grows into it, and despite being the youngest, he becomes the one who leads. Sam is much closer to Sonny Corleone, hot-tempered, volatile, immediate, the kind of man who reacts first and thinks later. His strength is obvious, but so is his temper. and that combination can be just as dangerous to his enemies as it is to himself. And according to his own family, Sam is more than just talk. He's willing to act. In one incident at a gambling hall, when a scuffle breaks out, Sam steps in. And it doesn't take long for things to escalate. Sam pulls a gun and puts it directly in the face of the person causing the trouble, a man named Jack Constantino, who ironically would marry into the family at a later date. It's the kind of moment that tells you everything you need to know. Sam doesn't hesitate, and he isn't one to be trifled with. And then there's Loreto. If Stefano is Michael and Sam is Sonny, Loreto falls somewhere closer to Fredo. Not as weak, but different. He's not a traitor like in the movie, but events will transpire that will show you he is moving at a different rhythm than his brothers. Still very much a Monastero, just not driven by the same instincts that will ultimately define Stefano and Sam. Loreto chooses religion as his profession, becoming a priest, though at one point he would also work as the manager of an Italian aeroplane company. And it's that dynamic between these three brothers that's going to shape everything that comes next. If it sounds familiar, it should, because long before anyone ever wrote about the Corleone family, you already have the same dynamic taking shape here. The quiet strategist, the hot-headed enforcer, and the brother who never quite fits the mold. But this isn't fiction, these men are real, and unlike the movies, there's no script waiting for them, only opportunity, and ultimately, violence. So the big question, why Pittsburgh and when? The move to Pittsburgh isn't random. It's not chance, it's not opportunity in the abstract, it's family. After the early losses in Caccamo, including the death of their father, the Monastero family is left looking outward. And when that moment comes, there's already a path waiting for them, because Pietro's extended family is already there, and there's something else. According to Monastero's modern-day family, a payment is made to Pietro's widow, Giuseppa. They don't know exactly how much, but they are clear on one thing. It's enough. Enough to stabilize the family, enough to make a decision, enough to leave. Because whatever that payment is, it helps set the next move in motion. And that move leads to Pittsburgh. At the center of it are two men, Giuseppe Leone and his son, George Leone. And interestingly, it's George who arrives first. He immigrates to the United States in 1898 at the age of just 13, establishing an early foothold in Pittsburgh. A few years later, in 1901, his father Giuseppe follows. By 1904, Giuseppe, aged 57, becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen, older, established, and firmly rooted in the community. Together they become the anchor, not just for the Monasteros, but for an entire chain of migration, because once that foothold exists, others follow. Additionally, there are multiple marital ties to the Catalano family of Pittsburgh, as confirmed to me by the Monastero family. Of course, we've heard plenty of both the Leone and Catalano family names in previous episodes, although this Leone clan appears to be different than the Orazio Leone discussed in previous episodes. But you can begin to see how everything is somewhat interconnected. In November 1902, Salvatore, Sam, makes the journey first. He's young, likely closer to 16, despite listing himself as older, and he arrives in Pittsburgh, drawn directly into the orbit of the Leone family, into the household of his uncle, George Leone. This is how it begins, not with ambition, but with connection. He lists his occupation as shoemaker, possibly an homage to his father, but more likely what he thought his career might be at that young age. Stefano follows in December of 1905, just 14 years old. He joins Sam in Pittsburgh, stepping into a world that's already been established for him. And years later, in 1910, Loreto, the oldest at age 30, makes the journey as well. By 1912, he makes a trip back to Italy and returns again, this time bringing their mother, Giuseppa, and their sister, Providenza, with him. By that point, most of the family is no longer in Sicily. They're here, in Pittsburgh, and they're not arriving alone. They're arriving into something that's already in motion. As the Monastero brothers settle into Pittsburgh, something else begins to take shape alongside their arrival: stability. Not all at once, but piece by piece. For Sam, that process begins early. In 1908, at just 22 years old, he marries Francicia Duca, who is 17 at the time. And by 1910, he's already established enough to appear in the U.S. Census as the head of his household, living in Pittsburgh and working as a merchant in the fruit trade. It's a small detail, but an important one, because it shows that Sam isn't just surviving, he's building. In 1911, after a return trip to Italy, he comes back to the United States and soon after welcomes the birth of his daughter Josephine on July 2nd. At that point, he lists his occupation as a salesman, and the family is living at 921 East Street. His World War I draft registration card lists him as self-employed in fruit and groceries, living on Sandusky Street. Short in stature, stout in build, brown eyes, dark hair, he's no longer just a young immigrant finding his footing, he's established. And by 1920, that stability is even more visible. Sam is still the head of the household, still in Pittsburgh, now operating as a storekeeper of a grocery business. His sister, Providenza, is living with the family and working alongside him as a saleswoman in the same store. His household has grown as well, with his daughter Josephine and another daughter, Concettina, appearing in the census, though records on Concettina are otherwise scarce. A business, a household, a family network working together. For Sam, the foundation is firmly in place. Stefano's path runs parallel, but with its own turns. When he first arrives in Pittsburgh as a teenager, he lists his occupation as a tailor, a trade, something practical, something steady. Although his career would veer in other directions, like his father, he'd also be noted as working in the shoe repair business at least into 1916. By 1906, after a return trip to Italy, he's already describing himself differently, a proprietor. Somewhere in that short span of time, the shift has already begun. His personal life, however, is less stable. At some point after 1906, Stefano marries Rose, also referred to as Rosa Casali. The exact date is unclear. The records don't give us a clean answer, but what is clear is where things begin to fall apart. Because by 1910, the marriage is already breaking down. That year, Rose formally files for divorce in common pleas court on the grounds of desertion. It's the first clear documented sign that whatever existed between them has deteriorated beyond repair. But even then, it doesn't end. The separation drags on. The tension lingers. What should have been a clean legal break instead stretches out over years, complicated, unresolved, and deeply personal. By around 1913, according to family accounts, the two are effectively living apart. And by 1914, the accusations escalate. Now described as cruel and barbarous treatment, yet still no final divorce. This is not a clean break, it's drawn out, messy, and personal. And then in 1914, something happens that pulls the entire family into public view. Remember when we said Loreto moves at a different rhythm than his brothers? This is what that looks like. On the night of August 31st, 1914, a domestic situation turns violent. According to newspaper reports, Loreto Monastero, at one time a priest, has become infatuated with his brother Stefano's estranged wife, Rose Casali. Rose tells authorities that Loreto had been pursuing her for over a year, even after her divorce from Stefano, pressing his attention, writing to her, and when ignored, escalating to threats. She states that Loreto had threatened to shoot her multiple times. Clearly, this man is unhinged and a stalker. Earlier that day, he visits her at her workplace, continuing the unwanted attention for hours. Later that evening, he goes to the family's home on Reedsdale Street. He enters and calls out to Rose. She refuses to come. Instead, her mother, Angeline Casali, steps in. What happens next unfolds quickly. An argument, a confrontation, and then Loreto produces a revolver. Rose later tells authorities that her mother steps between them. Loreto fires 2 shots. Both strike Angeline Casali in the back. She dies almost instantly. Loreto flees the scene but is quickly captured after running several blocks. He's taken into custody and brought to the Allegheny police station. In the aftermath, both Stefano and Sam are brought in as well, held as witnesses. And just like that, a private family matter becomes a public tragedy, because the Casali family had already endured more than most. 9 years earlier, Rose's father, overwhelmed by business troubles, had taken his own life, drowning himself in the Allegheny River. And in the year leading up to this moment, the family had been living under pressure. Angeline Casali had received blackhand threats, demands for money, and when those demands went unanswered, her home had been bombed. This was a family already marked by hardship, and now it ends in violence. In addition to Loreto, both Stefano and Sam are initially locked up as witnesses, but the story doesn't end with Loreto's arrest, because within hours, he's gone. Sometime around 4 o'clock in the morning, while being held at the Allegheny police station, Loreto Monastero manages to slip out of his cell and escape. Accounts suggest a combination of circumstance and opportunity. The cell door found open, a steel door left unsecured, and a brief window where supervision lapsed. By the time authorities realize what's happened, he's already disappeared into the city. And what follows is chaos. Police launch a citywide manhunt. Railroad stations watched, ferries monitored, patrols sweeping the north side. Detectives believe he's being sheltered by friends, hidden somewhere within the Italian community. What makes it worse is that Loreto isn't just another suspect. He's educated, resourceful, familiar with the system, and for a time he simply vanishes. But the freedom doesn't last. Within roughly 40 hours, Loreto Monastero is found. Not fleeing the state, not hiding in some distant city, but sitting calmly in Westview, reading a newspaper, following the coverage of his own escape. He's recognized and quietly approached by County Detective Michael J. Grand, an acquaintance. Loreto, caught off guard, offers no resistance. His clothes are torn, his condition worn down. He hasn't eaten, surviving on raw corn pulled from fields, sleeping in a stable, wandering the countryside just beyond the city. Despite one of the largest manhunts in the area, rail stations watched, roads covered, a 50-mile radius searched, he had never truly left Pittsburgh. After his capture, Loreto is formally charged with the murder of Angeline Casali. And just like that, the chase is over. And once he's back in custody, Loreto Monastero does something not wholly unexpected. He denies everything. Through his attorney, he insists he is innocent, that he had no romantic involvement with Rose Casali, no plan to elope, no reason to commit the murder. The entire motive, he claims, is fabricated. His defense paints a very different picture of the man at the center of the case. Educated, mild-mannered, deeply religious. A man who had spent years preparing for the priesthood. Someone, they argue, incapable of violence, let alone murder. Even members of his own family step forward backing that version of him. They claim he had gone to the house not out of passion, but to help reconcile Rose with her husband. And then there's Loreto himself. At one point, he reportedly makes a dramatic declaration, "But Jesus will save me." Whether it was faith, desperation, or performance, it only adds another layer to an already sensational case. And as the case moves forward, it only grows more complicated. By September 18th, Loreto Monastero is formally held for the grand jury. No bail, no release. His fate now moving into the next phase of the legal system. The prosecution begins to take shape, built largely around the testimony of one key witness, Rose Casali, the same woman at the center of it all. She identifies Loreto. She places him at the scene. She becomes the cornerstone of the case against him. And yet, at the very same time, everything begins to shift. Because while Loreto sits in jail awaiting trial, Rose Casali and Stefano Monastero begin moving back toward each other, quietly, almost unbelievably. By November 11th, 1914, Loreto is indicted for murder. And almost in parallel, Stefano and Rose reconcile. The divorce that had fractured them undone. In fact, they never actually got divorced. They were just estranged. The scandal, the violence, the accusations somehow giving way to reunion. In fact, reports suggest the two were already taking steps to remarry, resume their marriage, something, even appearing together publicly in the midst of the proceedings. So while one brother faces a murder charge that could end his life, the other rebuilds his. And just when it seems the case is finally heading towards a conclusion, everything changes. On December 15th, 1915, a special jury delivers its verdict. Loreto Monastero is declared insane, not temporarily unfit, not awaiting further evaluation, insane. Which means he will never stand trial for the murder of Angeline Casali. Instead, Loreto is ordered to be committed, initially to Marshalsea, an asylum later known as the Mayview State Hospital. He is removed from the courtroom and from the legal process entirely. The decision rests on the testimony from physicians who claim he is suffering from delusions, speaking of grand ideas, of philosophy, of things untethered from reality. The defense leans into it, portraying him as a man lost in his own mind. The prosecution isn't convinced. They argue something else, that Loreto is educated, calculating, and capable of playing a role, feigning insanity to escape justice. But in the end, it doesn't matter. The ruling stands. No trial, no verdict, no resolution. Just a case that begins in violence, spirals through scandal, escape, and spectacle, and ends with a man disappearing not into the streets this time, but into an institution. Later in the year, he is sent to the asylum in Woodville, and if that sounds like the end of it, it isn't. Because sometime in November of 1915, Loreto Monastero escapes again. This time not from a jail cell, but from the county asylum at Woodville, where he had been committed after being declared insane. And just like before, he doesn't do it alone. Authorities suspect he had help, spirited away by friends, moved quickly, quietly, and with purpose. By the time anyone realizes he's gone, he's already disappeared. Again. Searches sweep Pittsburgh. Detectives question known associates, probably his brothers. Leads are chased across neighborhoods and beyond the city limits, but this time the trail doesn't just go cold, it goes overseas. By December of 1915, authorities come to believe that Loreto Monastero has fled to Italy, escaping not just custody, but the country itself. And with that, he is gone, not into hiding, but out of reach. From this point forward in our story, Loreto becomes a non-factor, although I'm sure any interactions between him and his brother after this were awkward at best and painful at least. He will die in 1928 in Rome at age 48. While Loreto's story spirals into violence, scandal, and ultimately disappearance, Stefano's path is moving in a very different direction. In May of 1914, just before the shooting of his wife's mother, before the trial, before the entire situation explodes, Stefano quietly becomes a naturalized citizen of the United States. And at the same time, the official record shows something else: stability. In his naturalization papers, he lists his occupation once again as a tailor. He's living on East Street, sharing a home with his brother Sam. The details are clinical, almost impersonal. 5'8", 150 pounds, fair complexion, a scar on his left cheek, but together they form a clear picture. He's building something. While everything around him is beginning to fracture, his marriage, his family, the world pulling at him from every direction, Stefano is putting down roots, establishing himself, positioning himself in a city that is about to change dramatically. And unlike his brother, Stefano isn't unraveling, he's preparing. By 1918, he's no longer Stefano, at least not in the paper. He's Stephen, or Steve, Joseph Monastero. By 1918, his World War I draft registration card lists him as a merchant living on 222 Anderson Street on Pittsburgh's north side. Taller, medium build, gray eyes, brown hair, and notably, still married. And by 1920, the picture comes fully into focus. Now going by Stephen, he's the head of his own household, living in Pittsburgh, working as a wholesale fruit partner. His wife is listed as Rose Casali Monastero, and the family includes their daughters, Josephine, Marie, and a third daughter, Providence, who will go by Joan, born that same year. So just like Sam, Stefano is building something, a business, a household, a presence. And not unlike Sam, Stefano isn't just settling into the system, he's positioning himself within it. And it's here, within this world of groceries, produce, and distribution, that something else begins to take shape. Because in early 20th century Pittsburgh, the fruit and produce trade isn't just business, it's access, it's influence, and very often, it's something more. An early stronghold for the mafia in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. By 1912, you can already see the Monastero brothers moving within that world. In 1912, they are among some of the prominent names mentioned in papers at an annual reception and dance given by the Societa Operaia di Mutuo Soccorso of East Liberty, an event attended by over 2,000 of the area's Italians. They show up again in 1914 at the Hotel Battaglia. A banquet is held to celebrate the recovery of the city's first alleged mafia boss, Salvatore Catanzaro. We've referenced this event in episodes number 46 and number 47. Officially, Catanzaro's recovering from a brief illness, though many sources suggest it was something far more violent, a stabbing. The event itself is hosted by the city's leading banana merchants, and the guest list matters. Salvatore Calderone, members of the Catalano family who, as we know, are already tied to the Monasteros through familial connections. A Gentile likely connected to Nicola Gentile, a known mafia figure, and a G. Leone, almost certainly George Leone. And among them, the Monastero brothers, or at least one of the Monastero brothers. They're young, Sam around 28, Stefano roughly 24, but they're there, in the room, in the circle. And that tells you something important. By 1914, they're not just working in the fruit business, they're operating within the same networks as the men already tied to organized crime. And in Pittsburgh at that time, that's not unusual. Because the fruit and grocery trade isn't just a legitimate industry, it's a space that frequently overlaps with mafia activity, a place where relationships are built, deals are made, and influence is quietly exercised. So when the Monastero brothers continue to rise within that world, it isn't a leap, it's a progression, and by 1918, that progression becomes formalized. In his World War I draft registration card, George Leone lists his employer as the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange, a company he helps found alongside Sam and Stefano Monastero. In May of that year, Western Pennsylvania issues the official charter, $10,000 in capital, over $200,000 in today's money. The founders are listed as L. Landolina, recorded as N. Laudolina in some documents, almost certainly a man named Nicasio Landolina. Stefano Monastero, Sam Monastero, who will serve as the president, and George Leone. But that's not the full picture, because there's another name tied to this operation. Pietro Carollo, a cheese buyer based out of Pittsburgh who, according to Bureau of Investigation interviews conducted between December 1918 and November 1919, is one of 7 members of the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange Company. And Carollo's activities stretch far beyond Pittsburgh. In those interviews, he describes traveling through Colorado, Pueblo, Aguilar, Trinidad, purchasing and shipping goods back to Pittsburgh, a carload of cheese, 1,000 gallons of olive oil, moving product across state lines, operating out of a network that extends well beyond a single city. At one point, he's working out of a Pueblo, Colorado grocery store at 900 Elm Street, operated by a man named Tony Viola. But Tony Viola isn't who he claims to be. It's an alias for a man whose real name is Pellegrino Scalia, a major mafia figure in southern Colorado whose murder in 1922 will ignite a violent war between Sicilian factions in that region. And back in Pittsburgh, Carollo's own listed address ties him even closer to the center of power. On his World War I draft registration card, he gives his address as 801 Wiley Avenue, the same address as Pittsburgh Wine and Liquor owned by Gregorio Conti. So now the connections, they're no longer so subtle, they're direct. The Monastero brothers, their business partner, their network, all intersecting with known mafia figures across multiple cities. And then in February 1919, they take the next step. They purchase a large warehouse at 2315 Penn Avenue, a central hub for the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange. They would eventually have a second warehouse building at 2006 on Pike Street, and several others, from what I read. On paper, it's a wholesale grocery operation, a legitimate enterprise, but by this point, given the people involved, the connections established, and the world they're operating in, it's clear that this business is more than just fruit. But that's a story that we'll tell after another word from our sponsors. And this is where everything begins to change. Up to this point, Stefano's story has been grounded in family, immigration, and personal conflict. But as the 1910s give way to a new decade, the environment around him begins to transform, the rules shift, the opportunities expand, and for men positioned the right way, the rewards become enormous, generational wealth. Because Prohibition is coming, and with it, an entirely new kind of underworld. What had once been small-scale operations, local disputes, neighborhood businesses, quiet associations, now evolves into something far more structured, more competitive, more violent. Cities like Pittsburgh don't just see crime increase, they see the rise of organized systems built to control it. And the Monastero brothers are right there at the center of it, not as bystanders, not as minor players, but as men already connected, already embedded in the networks that matter, through business, through family, and through association. The fruit and produce trade, the same world they had been operating in for years, a legitimate industry on the surface, but one that overlaps constantly with the movement of goods, money, and influence, the perfect foundation for something much bigger. So as Prohibition takes hold, the Monasteros don't step into the underworld, they grow into it. At 2315 Penn Avenue, in the heart of the Strip District, sits the warehouse of the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange, the very operation the Monastero brothers helped establish just a few years earlier. On the surface, this is the center of the city's wholesale food trade, produce shipments, rail access, everything moving through a dense working-class marketplace. But beneath that, something else is already established. Because years before Prohibition ever arrives, the Strip District is already saturated with vice. In 1915, just 5 years before the 18th Amendment takes effect, the Christian Social Service Union surveys the area and finds 96 saloons packed into barely 3/5 of a square mile. Their conclusion is blunt. No one in the Strip District needs to go thirsty. Drunkenness is rampant. The district, in their words, is polluted, men drinking openly while families struggle to survive around them. This isn't written by bootleggers, it's written by reformers. And it tells you everything you need to know about the ground Prohibition is about to land on, because when Prohibition arrives in 1920, it doesn't descend on a dry city tempted into crime. It lands in a city already built for it. And by the early 1920s, Pittsburgh develops a national reputation for being unusually wet, as we covered at length in the last episode. Not because laws don't exist, they do. Raids happen, arrests are made. But enforcement is only as strong as the system behind it. Courts, police, politicians, and the public all have to align. In Pittsburgh, they don't. Which means places like the Strip District don't disappear under Prohibition, they evolve. To learn more about the extreme conditions of vice and relative lawlessness in Pittsburgh at the time, go back and watch episode number 48, which heavily covered the conditions of Prohibition Pittsburgh and why the city was so ripe for bootlegging and the violence that would come with it. And right in the middle of it, inside the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange warehouse at 2315 Penn Avenue, the Monastero brothers are operating a business that gives them access to everything: goods, movement, relationships, and opportunity. But they don't limit themselves to a single location. They secure another location for the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange, a 4-story building at 2006 Pike Street that historically would have also been located in the city's Strip District near the modern-day 2000 block of Smallman Street, significantly extending the capacity of their operation to support citywide distribution. On paper, these are wholesale produce facilities. In practice, they're different. They form a network. One rooted in legitimate commerce, but positioned perfectly for something much larger, linking neighborhoods, controlling movement, and giving the Monasteros the infrastructure they need to operate in a city where the line between business and vice is rapidly disappearing. And then, in May of 1920, the violence arrives at their doorstep. At a barbershop located at 2025 Penn Avenue, just down the street from the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange warehouse at 2315 Penn Avenue, a bomb detonates, tearing through the building violently and damaging structures for blocks. Windows shatter. A passing streetcar is struck by debris. More than 20 people are injured, and the damage is estimated at $40,000, a staggering sum for the time. According to reports, the bomb was placed in or adjacent to the structure, which was owned by Nicasio Landolina, one of the key partners in the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange, which raises an immediate question. Was the leadership of the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange the intended target, or was Nicasio simply caught in the blast by accident? There's no clear answer. But what is clear is that the exchange, right in the center of Monastero territory, is significantly damaged. Newspapers are quick to assign blame. They call it the work of the Black Hand. But by 1920, that label is often more reflex than reality, because what once resembled organized extortion has by this point fractured into something far less centralized. Pittsburgh's underworld is no longer controlled by a single hand. It is splintered into rival gangs, competing networks in overlapping territories with overlapping interests. Some Italian, some not. Many fighting for the same opportunities Prohibition has just created. And in that environment, a bombing like this doesn't have to be ideological. It doesn't necessarily come from the Black Hand. It can be strategic, a warning, a message, a claim. The kind of message meant to tell whoever is operating in that corridor that they are not alone and they are not welcome. If that message was meant for the Monastero brothers, it doesn't land the way that it was intended, because instead of retreating or laying low or reconsidering their position, they push forward. If anything, it emboldens them. What follows over the next several years is not chaos. It's construction, deliberate, methodical, and increasingly difficult to stop. They rebuild quickly. While Pittsburgh's underworld fractures in the wake of Prohibition, with gangs forming, territories overlapping, and violence flaring across the city, the Monastero brothers move in a different direction. They are not simply reacting to opportunity, they are building something designed to last. By 1920, they move fully into bootlegging, but not as small operators working the margins. They position themselves as the source of the entire operation, understanding early that the real power is not in selling alcohol by the drink, but in controlling everything that makes it possible. Corn sugar, stills, coils, bottles, labels, entire bootlegging setups. If you want to produce liquor in Pittsburgh, you do not just compete with the Monasteros, you go through them. Later accounts would describe it plainly. Monastero, for 4 years, has been known as king of the bootleg supply racket. He controlled at least 2 big warehouses from which he supplied corn sugar, stills, coils, bottles, labels, and complete bootlegging plants. That is not retail, that is infrastructure. It places him not at the edge of the system, but directly at its center. From 1920 to 1927, that system expands outward with increasing precision. Operating out of the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange warehouse on Penn Avenue and their East End facility on Pike Street, they construct something that looks less like a gang and more like an integrated network. Supply routes are established, distribution channels are secured, and relationships with retailers and the police are cultivated and enforced. One report would later note that, quote, he was in the booze manufacturing business and he had provided good whiskey for retailers and better stuff for his friends. A detail that hints at both control and loyalty within the system he built. At the same time, they establish a more personal base of operations. In 1921, the brothers purchase a duplex at 3941 Perryview Street on Pittsburgh's north side, sometimes listed as 39 and 41 Perryview Avenue, separately, not 3941, 39 and 41. Sam occupies the first floor, while Stefano lives above him. According to family accounts, the arrangement is intentional. They live together for protection. The house functions not just as a residence, but as a compound, a place where decisions are made, alliances are managed, and security is constant. It's deep into their territory in the north side. This is also a moment where the duality of Stefano Monastero becomes visible. In October of 1923, he's part of a delegation that meets Major Fiorella LaGuardia, then a congressman from New York who is in Pittsburgh as the keynote speaker for a Columbus Day banquet at the Emerita Club on Fernando Street. There is nothing outwardly unusual about the event. It is formal, civic, respectable, yet the irony is unmistakable. This is the same LaGuardia who, less than a decade later, will become the mayor of New York City and a central figure in the fight against organized crime. In 1923, he is shaking hands with a man who is quietly building one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Pittsburgh. By the mid-1920s, Pittsburgh remains fragmented, but the trajectory is clear. Like other major cities during Prohibition, it is moving towards consolidation, and the Monasteros are at the center of that shift. Their organization increasingly defines territory not just in geographic terms, but in terms of control. Who produces, who distributes, who sells, and who is allowed to operate. Encroachments are not negotiated, they are answered, and they are answered violently. This is the side of their rise that does not appear cleanly in official records. From 1920 to 1927, there are no direct charges that fully capture the scope of their operation. No single case lays it out in detail, but later accounts begin to fill in the gaps. And what they describe is unmistakable. By 1925, the Monastero brothers are at the top of the Pittsburgh underworld, spoken about in whispers, understood by those operating within it, known to law enforcement even, but never proven to be anything other than legitimate businessmen in a court of law. One paper would later describe Stefano as, quote, for 4 years one of the overlords of the underworld in Pittsburgh, while others would call him the Racket King and the reputed overlord of the liquor supply ring. The way he moves reflects that position. He is reported to have driven a steel-armored car fitted with 3/4-inch bulletproof glass, and he and his brother are often surrounded by armed guards who travel with them day and night. This is not the posture of a small-time operator. This isn't the posture of somebody who's simply in the fruit and produce business. It's the posture of a man who understands both the scale of his power and the constant threat that comes with it. Violence becomes an ever-present feature of the city. Murders, often described at the time as mysterious Black Hand killings, begin to accumulate across Pittsburgh. Shootings in the Hill District, bodies found in alleys, men disappearing after crossing the wrong line. Over time, these indictments form a pattern. Quote, for 4 years, one report would later state, gangland's guns have belched death in Pittsburgh's streets and alleys. Dozens are killed within the city and dozens more across Allegheny County. Arrests are made, but in most cases, punishment never follows. Again and again, the same name surfaces. Authorities receive anonymous letters identifying Stefano Monastero as the figure behind the violence. One account recalls that government officials were inundated with communications naming him as the Racket King and even the Black Hand King responsible for the killings. Yet despite the volume of accusations, no case ever fully materializes and no charge ever holds. As the Monastero organization expands, it does not simply grow in size. It becomes more defined, more disciplined, and more deliberate in how it operates. What begins as a network of relationships tied to supply and distribution gradually takes on the characteristics of something more structured, something closer to what we would later recognize as a mafia organization. At that time, very little of this is documented in any official way. There are no organized charts, no public titles, and no formal acknowledgement of hierarchy yet. However, decades later, when federal investigators began collecting intelligence from informants, a clearer picture starts to emerge. One such informant would later recall being present at a Pittsburgh initiation ceremony in 1927. At that time, he identified Steve Monastero as the capo, the boss of the Pittsburgh group, with a man named Lamendola serving as what he described as a sotto capo, or second in command of a borgata, a family. The terminology is significant.
If you betray this family, may you burn in hell like this saint.
An initiation ceremony, combined with the use of hierarchical titles, suggests that by the late 1920s, the Monastero organization had begun to take on the characteristics of what we would recognize as the Mafia, Cosa Nostra. It is also worth noting that the Lamendola referenced here appears to be Nicasio Lamendola, Monastero's associate and co-founder in the Pittsburgh Fruit Exchange. Whether this role was truly held by Lamendola or by Sam Monastero, or perhaps divided in some way with Sam functioning in a different capacity, possibly akin to what we would later call a consigliere, remains unclear and ultimately unconfirmable. Even with that uncertainty, this report stands out. It represents one of the first clear direct indications of something resembling the more formalized Cosa Nostra structure that would later be documented. Earlier accounts involving figures like Catanzaro, Conti, Gentile, and Calderone are more difficult to verify, less direct, often built on innuendo, inference, or secondhand reporting, and tied to individuals who left fewer traceable connections to organized criminal activity. By contrast, what emerges in the Monastero period is sharper, a little more defined, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. At the same time, it raises an important possibility. This may not have been entirely new. It may have instead represented a continuation or evolution of what had already existed under earlier figures like Salvatore Catanzaro and Gregorio Conti, a system that was less documented and less visible, but already rooted in structure, hierarchy, and shared identity. By the time it becomes clear in the record, it may have already been in motion for years. Whether newly formed or carried forward, a structure like that does not exist in isolation. It has to be built out, reinforced, and sustained. That requires manpower. And the Monasteros recruit accordingly. Men are brought in not just as associates, but as soldiers, soldati, entering a system that demands loyalty and obedience. Roles begin to take shape, even if they are not yet formally formalized in the way they would be in later decades. There are leaders, there are enforcers, and there are those tasked with expanding the reach of the organization into new territories and rackets. There was considerable muscle used by us in Pittsburgh in the 1920s and 30s, one informant recalled. We regularly forced gamblers and club operators to take us in as partners in spite of objections, and anyone who resisted too much would have his property damaged and his head broken repeatedly until he accepted our man as his partner. It is a blunt description, but it captures the reality of how power operated on the ground. This is not a negotiation, it is coercion, and it extends well beyond bootlegging alone.
You got a nice place here. Shame if something ever happened to it.
While the Monasteros are building dominance in the manufacture and supply of illicit alcohol, they are simultaneously embedding themselves into the everyday economies of the neighborhoods they control. Gambling houses, social clubs, and small businesses, extracting tribute and asserting influence at every level. It's not that different from the Black Hand before them, and it's not that different from the Mafia after them. Most of the time, the arrangement is framed as a business transaction, with the organization buying its way into operations at what is described as a quote-unquote fair price. That fairness, however, exists only as long as the other party agrees. It is less a negotiation than a formality, a step in a process where the outcome is already understood. On other occasions, the terms are even simpler. Quote, "We took a one-half partnership without laying out any money at all." Close quote. This is how the system expands, not through just alcohol, but through control. Not just through supply, but through pressure. By the mid-1920s, the Monastero organization is not merely participating in Pittsburgh's underworld, it is positioning itself at the center of it with influence that reaches far beyond a single racket. This is the system the Monasteros are building, a system where ownership can be negotiated, but ultimately dictated. Businesses operate either under their protection or under their extreme pressure, and resistance is not just discouraged, but punished. As this approach spreads, their influence extends beyond bootlegging into gambling operations, clubs, and disorderly houses, each new foothold reinforcing the last. By the mid-1920s, the result is a city where power is no longer evenly distributed among competing gangs. It is concentrating. At the center of that concentration are the two Monastero brothers. The structure Stefano is building does not always draw attention to itself in obvious ways. It does not announce itself through formal titles or public declarations, doesn't always show up in papers. Instead, it embeds itself quietly into the fabric of the city. which is why by the time his true position becomes widely understood, it is already firmly established. Meanwhile, his organization continues to grow. Operating under Monastero's leadership, one report later concluded, for years a gang of Italian killers held the local Italian colony in a grip of terror, extorting fabulous sums from them and at the same time controlling the bootleg supplies. It goes on to note that the power of the Monasteros grew daily until those engaged in bootleg or disorderly house concessions either operated under their wing or else paid the penalty by going for a ride. That phrase, going for a ride, does not need further explanation. I think you know what it means. As their influence expands, their organization begins to take on a more defined structure. It's not yet formalized in the language that would later define La Cosa Nostra, but the elements are beginning to appear. Men are recruited, roles begin to take shape, loyalty is enforced. There are even indications of traditions and customs forming within the group, possibly including early forms of initiation. What emerges is something more cohesive than the loosely organized networks that came before. In many ways, this period marks a transition. Under earlier figures like Catanzaro and Conti, the organization existed in forms that are more difficult to document. With the Monasteros, the structure becomes clearer, even if it remains largely hidden at the time. Their rise would represent the early formation of what would eventually become known as the modern Pittsburgh Mafia family. By the mid-1920s, Stefano Monastero is no longer just a participant in Pittsburgh's underworld. He is its dominant force in the manufacturing and supply of illegal alcohol, the closest thing the city would have to its own Al Capone. He controls the north side and steadily extends his influence beyond it, shaping the direction of organized crime in Pittsburgh and beyond. At that point, the reality is simple. Anyone involved in the bootlegging business in Pittsburgh is operating within a system the Monasteros control. Cooperation ensures survival. Opposition carries consequences, and in that world there is very little room in between. To understand just how far that reach extends, you have to picture the city itself. On the north side, across the Allegheny River, the Monasteros hold their base of power, a tightly controlled stronghold rooted in neighborhoods like Allegheny City, Brighton Heights, East Allegheny, and the riverfront North Shore. This is not just a single point on a map, but a cluster of working-class communities, industrial corridors, and transportation arteries that give them both cover and control. Here, leadership, protection, and enforcement are concentrated, anchored in an area that sits just across the river from downtown Pittsburgh. From there, their influence stretches directly into the Strip District, where their Penn Avenue warehouse sits in the middle of one of the busiest commercial corridors in the city. This is not a hidden outpost. It is planted in the heart of Pittsburgh's produce trade, rail lines, and daily commerce, an environment defined by constant movement, labor, and opportunity. It's an ideal position for supplying and distributing illegal alcohol at scale. Just uphill from this strip lies the Hill District, a dense, vibrant neighborhood where nightlife, gambling, and underground economies thrive. Influence in the strip does not stop at its borders. It spills upward into the Hill, where control over supply naturally translates into control over the places where the supply is sold, consumed, and protected. This is expansion by design, pushing beyond a single neighborhood into a broader network that connects multiple parts of the city. Taken together, it forms a corridor of control, the north side to the Strip District, to the Hill District, to the East End, a connected footprint that allows the Monasteros to move product, enforce authority, and project power across Pittsburgh. This is not a neighborhood operation, this is a citywide system. But systems like this, no matter how controlled, no matter how carefully built, do not expand without friction. By the mid-1920s, Pittsburgh's underworld is no longer a loose collection of small operators. It's a landscape of competing ambitions, overlapping territories, and men who are not willing to simply disappear into someone else's structure. Some choose to cooperate with the Monasteros. Others operate under their protection. And then there are those inside the system who begin to carve out power of their own. One of those men is Luigi, the big gorilla Lamendola. Lamendola is not an outsider arriving from another city. He is Sicilian-born, born July 23, 1902, in Caltanissetta. And while his path to the United States is pretty difficult to trace, by the mid-1920s, he is clearly established in Pittsburgh's underworld. He operates out of the Hill District just outside of downtown, where his restaurant at 27 Chatham Street serves as the headquarters for a bootlegging operation holding hundreds of gallons of moonshine. He is not a fringe figure, but a key lieutenant tied directly into the Monastero organization and its expanding network. And yet he stands out. Police describe him as a man of means and a man to be feared, someone who moved as a king in his sphere. That kind of reputation is earned. In neighborhoods like the Hill District, men are not feared for what they say, they are feared for what they do and for what people believe they are willing to do. Lamendola looks the part, always sharp-dressed, always deliberate. He wears wealth openly, diamonds worked into his clothing, heavy rings on his fingers, and thick rolls of cash that make it clear he is operating with serious money. Nothing about him is understated. Even his physical presence, short and thick at roughly 5'8" and roughly 224 pounds, adds to it. He doesn't try to look refined. He looks dangerous. That's why he's got the nickname the Big Gorilla. It's pretty ironic, right? And he carries himself that way. Men like Lamendola do not rely on reputation alone. In this world, respect is enforced physically. Arguments do not linger. Debts do not go unpaid for long. The kind of fear attached to his name suggests a man who is quick to put his hands on a problem and even quicker to make sure the lesson sticks. The message is simple and widely understood. If you cross him, there will be consequences, and they will be immediate. You do not want to make an enemy out of the Big Gorilla. That is where his nickname comes from, not from humor, kind of from, it's kind of a little ironic, but from force. His associates call him the Big G, or Big G of the Hill, and in the neighborhoods where he operates, that name carries weight. It signals not just status, but consequence. People know who he is. More importantly, they know what comes with crossing him. And, as you might imagine, women notice him too. Contemporary descriptions point to a man who is polished, confident, and magnetic in his own way, a figure who draws attention the moment he enters a room. He moves easily through social spaces and carries himself with the kind of swagger that turns heads. He is, by all accounts, a hit with the ladies, but behind that image is something harder. Lamendola is not simply a businessman or a bootlegger. He is a man operating in an environment where power is enforced, not suggested. Contemporary reports place him at the head of a ring of suspected black-handers, and while those labels are often applied loosely, they are rarely attached without cause. His name circulates in connection with intimidation, with pressure, with the kind of consequences that follow those who refuse to cooperate. He is also expanding. Partnered with a man named Pete Curalato, Lamendola is not just participating in the bootlegging economy, he is building within it, building serious wealth, extending his influence into the Hill District, where he is both visible and feared. He operates like a man who understands power, and more importantly, like a man who intends to hold on to it. That is where the tension begins, because Lamendola does not operate like a man content to remain in the background. He operates like a man building something of his own within a system that does not tolerate divided authority. Up to this point, much of the violence tied to the Monastero rise exists in shadows, whispers, anonymous letters, patterns that can be inferred but not definitively proven. Murders are attributed but rarely traced. Responsibility is suspected but seldom confirmed. That's about to change, because with Lamendola, the conflict becomes visible. And for the first time, we begin to see a deadly chain of events that can be more directly connected to the Monastero organization. This is where the story shifts, from power built in the background to violence that cannot be ignored. For a man like Lamendola, success is not enough. By the mid-1920s, he has money, real money. He has influence in the Hill District, control over his own operations, and a reputation that commands attention wherever he goes. He dresses like a man at the top, spends like a man at the top, and moves through the city like a man who believes he belongs there. But in this world, wealth and power are not the same thing, and Lamendola knows it. Because no matter how successful he becomes, he is still operating inside someone else's system. The supply lines he depends on, the territory he works in, the structure that protects and limits him, all trace back to one man, Stefano Monastero. At some point, that reality begins to wear thin. Lamendola does not see himself as a subordinate. He doesn't carry himself like a subordinate, and as his confidence grows, so does his ambition. He begins to speak more freely, more openly about where he sees himself, not just as a player within the organization, but at the head of it.
I built my end of this operation myself.
I know exactly what you built.
I'm tired of being treated like I work for you.
You're making a mistake.
That kind of talk does not stay quiet. In an underworld built on hierarchy, loyalty, and control, ambition is not just dangerous, it is destabilizing. A man who reaches too far, too openly, is not just a threat to one person, he's a threat to the entire structure.
Nice place you got here.
Please, I don't want any trouble, Mr. Lamendola.
Then you'll start buying your whiskey and beer from me instead of the Monasteros. Business changes fast in this city. Understand? Good. We understand each other.
And Lamendola, by all accounts, begins to reach. He boasts. He talks. He lets it be known, whether in confidence or carelessness, that he wants more.
I built this whole goddamn operation in the hill, and I'm still supposed to kiss Steve's rink?
Everything we got, we earned ourselves.
I'm done taking orders. Steve and Sam are standing in my way, and sooner or later that problem gets solved.
Fuck them. They never gave us anything we didn't take ourselves.
Not just money, not just territory, power. The kind of power that belongs to a boss. But in a system like this, there is only room for one man at the top.
Louis been running his mouth again, saying Steve's in his way. Says he's done taking orders.
You sure?
He said in front of witnesses.
All right.
And in that world, ambition, spoken to openly, has a way of becoming a death warrant.
Luigi's talking too much.
He's out of control.
If he's threatening the family, then he already made his choice.
So what do? We end it.
May 19th, 1927, the Hill District. It's late in the evening, around 10:25 p.m. on Chatham Street in the Hill District, just off Wiley Avenue, in one of the most lively corridors in Pittsburgh, where nightlife spills out into the streets. Saloons, cafes, and clubs cast warm light onto the sidewalks. Music drifts through open doors, piano keys, horns, laughter, conversation layered over the steady hum of the city. The air carries everything at once: tobacco smoke, cooked meat, spilled beer, the faint metallic edge of industry that never fully leaves Pittsburgh's neighborhoods. Streetcars rattle somewhere in the distance. Voices rise and fall. Doors swing open and shut. It's a place where people gather, where business is conducted in plain sight, where nothing ever feels entirely still. Outside 27 Chatham Street, Luigi the big gorilla Lamendola stands in the doorway of his restaurant. He's with two men, his partner Pete Curolato and another associate. They're talking, relaxed, unhurried. Lamendola is in the middle of it, holding court the way men like him do, telling a story, talking with his hands, animated, confident, fully in command of the moment. Maybe it's a joke, something that draws a reaction, something that keeps the attention on him. This is his ground, his street, his people. And because of that, he isn't watching the road. Down the block, a touring car turns onto Chatham Street. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to. The engine hum blends into the noise of the neighborhood. Another car on another street. Nothing unusual. It moves slowly, deliberately, closing the distance one car length at a time. No one reacts. Not the people on the sidewalks, not the voices spilling out of nearby bars, not Lamendola. He keeps talking. The car rolls closer, closer, and then it's there. The gunmen don't step out, they don't announce themselves, they fire from inside the car. The blast of a sawed-off shotgun cuts through everything. It's louder than the music, louder than the voices, louder than anything on the street. At close range, there is no survival. The reports are blunt. Lamendola's head is shattered by the double charge. The force drops him instantly, collapsing where he stands in the doorway of his own establishment. The entire moment, conversation to gunfire, is measured in seconds. Pete Curolato is hit in the face, wounded but alive. Another man, Carl Spaulo, escapes serious injury. They had been standing right there, close enough to be part of the conversation, close enough to be part of the kill zone. The car is already moving quickly down the street. No hesitation, no second look. It disappears back into the night, into the same noise it arrived through. For a brief moment, the street doesn't react. Then it's thrown into chaos. Voices stop, music falters, people turn, someone shouts. The realization spreads outward from the doorway, fast, then faster. Luigi Lamendola, the big gorilla, Big G from the hill, is down. He's rushed to Mercy Hospital. He dies within half an hour. By the next morning, the story is everywhere.
Extra! Extra! Cafe owner killed by gunmen! Read all about it. Big Hill District shooting! The big gorilla murdered!
The Pittsburgh Press describes the hit in vivid detail. Quote, "Hunt slayers of Lamendola. City detectives are scouring the Hill District for 4 killers who ambushed Luigi Lamendola, age 35, the big gorilla, and murdered him in front of his restaurant, 27 Chatham Street, last night. Lamendola's head was shattered by the double charge of a shotgun fired at close range. He died within a half hour in Mercy Hospital. 2 men were standing in the doorway of the restaurant conversing with Lamendola when the assassins drove up in a touring car and fired. They are held by the homicide squad. One, Peter Curolato, age 38, said to be a partner of the dead man, was wounded in the face but not seriously. The other is Carl Spaulo, age 27, of 820 Wiley Avenue. The only clue is a shotgun, which was found in Bigelow Boulevard near Washington Street, where it is believed the murderers threw it from their automobile in their flight. Cartridges reported found in the luxurious bachelor apartment of Lamendola, second floor of 27 Chatham Street, were of the same caliber as those used in the killing, and detectives have adopted the tentative theory that the slaying of Lamendola was the result of a plot within his own organization. They declared that they have evidence to indicate that Lamendola was at the head of a bootlegging ring which had headquartered at his restaurant. A search of the premises revealed, they said, several hundred gallons of moonshine, which were confiscated. Another report being investigated is one that Lamendola was wooing a married woman. Lamendola was a man of means and much feared in the Hill District, police said. Diamonds in his clothing were said by a jeweler to be worth $12,000. One ring was purchased by him recently for $4,000, it was said. $4,000 bills were found in his wallet, police said. A natty dresser, rich, and so handsome that he was called, ironically, the Big Gorilla. Lamendola moved as a king in his sphere, police insisted. So great was the fear of him, they said, that his associates abbreviated the nickname to the Big G. The 2 men detained by police asserted they knew nothing to indicate the identity of the killers. Curolato, alleged partner of the victim, is said to have had several $1,000s in his pocket when arrested. Detectives move quickly, but the answers do not come easily. From the beginning, the nature of the attack stands out. The killers are described as experienced. The approach is controlled, deliberate, efficient. No wasted movement, no hesitation. A touring car pulls in, shots are fired at close range, and within seconds it's over. This is not random violence, it's targeted. Initial theories follow familiar lines. Investigators look to liquor traffic rivalries, bootlegging disputes, territorial jealousy. Others suggest a more personal motive, pointing to rumors that Lamendola had been involved with a married woman. There are persistent reports that he was the ringleader of a group of black-handers, a term still used in the press at the time, but increasingly synonymous with something more organized and more structured, the mafia. But even early on, there are signs that this just runs deeper. The precision of the killing, the confidence of the gunman, the timing, all of it suggests planning. Not an outside crew passing through, but men who knew exactly where Lamendola would be, when he would be there, and how to reach him without resistance. In other words, this does not look like an external attack, it looks internal. because men like Lamendola are not killed by strangers. They are killed by men operating inside the same world, men operating inside the same system of power, discipline, and control. Detectives begin to consider that possibility, quietly at first, then more directly. Some come to believe that the killing may have originated from within his own organization, a plot, as one report puts it, within his own ranks. Suspicion inevitably drifts toward the Monastero group, but belief is not proof. No one talks, no one cooperates, and without witnesses willing to step forward, the case stalls. Like so many killings in this era, it remains officially unsolved. The men responsible are never identified, never arrested, and never brought to justice. And then, as quickly as he was removed from the streets of Pittsburgh, Luigi Lamendola disappears from it entirely. In July of 1927, his body is returned to Sicily. Reports describe a burial carried out with striking ceremony, a gorgeous silver casket that was the wonder of the countryside, high honors in his hometown. In some accounts, his reputation has already begun to shift, not just as a bootlegger, but something more ambiguous, even mythologized. There are claims, unverified but telling, that he was believed by some to be connected to fascist circles. Personally, I think that was just a mix-up with another Lamendola who was murdered around the same time in a different city. Others remember him simply as Big G of the Hill. In Pittsburgh, the case fades. In Sicily, he is buried with ceremony, and the mystery of who killed him and why remains. After the murder, two particularly peculiar events unfold, details that on their own might seem incidental, but viewed together and with the benefit of hindsight, they begin to point in a very specific direction. The first appears in the local papers in June of 1927. Quote, Commonwealth Trust Company of Pittsburgh, Administrator, 312 4th Avenue, Pittsburgh, PA. Notice is hereby given that letters of administration on the estate of Luigi Lamendola, late of Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, have been granted to the undersigned, to whom all persons indebted to said estate are to make immediate payment. Those having claims or demands against same will make them known without delay. Potter Title and Trust Company, Administrator. Close quote. On its face, there is nothing remarkable about this. It is the standard legal notice, routine, procedural, easy to overlook. But then, about a year later, another name surfaces connected to the Potter Title and Trust Company, Stefano Monastero. Now, that alone does not prove anything. It could be pure coincidence. It could be nothing more than overlapping business within the same financial institution. It's even possible that Monastero, like many organized crime figures of the era, centralized activity through a single trusted bank and encouraged his men to do the same. Maybe they just had a bank account at the same bank. In other words, standing alone, this detail doesn't really tell us much. But then there's a second event, and this one's a little harder to dismiss. According to reporting later highlighted by Pittsburgh Post-Gazette journalist Steve Mellon, the man who steps forward at the morgue to identify Luigi Lamendola's body is none other than Stefano Monastero himself. Attached to the coroner's report is a statement attributed to him.
I have known the deceased for several years. I am positive he has no relatives in this country. I know nothing of the circumstances leading up to my friend's death.
You were close with him?
We worked in the same neighborhoods, same business circles. Pittsburgh's not such a large city for Italians.
And you never heard about trouble? Problems with anybody?
In our world, detective, people always have problems with somebody.
Friend, huh? If that's true, it raises kind of an uncomfortable question. If Lamendola had no family here, then who exactly is the Potter Title and Trust collecting money for? And then there is the death certificate itself, clinical, detached, almost indifferent. The death was caused by shock and hemorrhage following gunshot wound of the head. But at the bottom, on the line where the party identifying the body, there's a name, S.J. Monastero. And that is where the story turns eerily cold. Because if the suspicions are correct, if this was in fact an internal hit on a member of his crime family, then the man who may have ordered Lamendola's death is also the man who formally identified his body. In a very real sense, he signs his death warrant twice, once in ordering it and again in confirming it. And like Lamendola's body lying on that slab, the act itself is cold, gangster. And in that world, actions like that don't exist in a vacuum, because there's an old understanding in organized crime. When you kill a man, you don't eliminate the problem, you inherit it. Friends, allies, debts, loyalties, all of it transfers. When you kill a man, several people then spring up. New enemies emerge just by killing one person, right? Kill one, 3 more pop up. Luigi Lamendola had all of those things. He had friends. And the men connected to him were not small-time operators either. They were capable, violent, embedded in the same world. Which means this doesn't end with his death. It only begins with it. What follows is not a quiet consolidation of power, but a violent struggle for it. A war that will ripple across Pittsburgh's underworld as the Monasteros move to eliminate any remaining opposition. The question is not whether they will fight. The question is whether they will survive what comes next. But that is a story for another day. Thank you for listening to the Gangland History Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support the show more directly, get access to ad-free episodes, exclusive content, and behind-the-scenes extras, head on over to my Patreon and consider becoming a capo. It's just $5 per month, and it's a low-pressure way to show your support in order to keep the podcast going strong. Every little bit of support means a lot. For a full bibliography of the primary and secondary sources consulted in the making of this episode, visit ganglandhistorypodcast.com. Until next time, may your envelopes be heavy and your troubles light. Goodbye, everybody.